Do you think that, and you've said this, that progressivism is really at this point, so it's sort of fueled by the exhausted fumes of Christianity.
Yep.
It has the sense that the world is so broken, it is absolutely urgent that every single one of us fix it now, and that it can be made perfect, and that the solution is very simple. Tell me more about that. Does that mean that it might be hard to export? It certainly seems to, from the point of view of the Chinese and the Russians, to be absurd. I mean, they are making jokes about this American tendency. But in the West, in general, it seems to be spreading. Tell me why you think that is happening.
Yeah, that's a question I've asked myself. I mean, there was this piece by Tyler Cohen that you probably saw on Bloomberg about whether preaching the gospel of wokeness is a good or a bad thing. I tend to disagree with him in that, although I agree with him in every other thing. And by the way, I thought his podcast interview was very good a couple weeks ago. Yeah, I think it's going to be hard to export, right? Because again, Christian universalism is one thing, but Anglo-Saxon racial politics are another, right? So to take one example, just near and dear to my heart, again, I tend to not to jump into these culture war phrases because I just don't think I have the constitution to deal with it. But one thing that just blew me up completely is this term, I still don't know how to pronounce it because it's unpronounceable in Spanish, Latinx or Latinx or however you pronounce this thing, right? Which a Pew Research study says that 96% of Hispanics either don't even know what it means or don't want to use it. Right? Because of course it's ridiculous. It can't even be pronounced in the Spanish, and the language of the culture purports to represent. It's a ridiculous term. That's obviously a top-down, elite, progressive white thing that I'm not even sure what it's supposed to get at. But clearly it's almost.
I think what it's supposed to get at, as I understand it, is that to say Latino would exclude women, to say Latina would exclude men, and on top of that, it's important that we abolish all gender binaries in our actual language and grammar, because for some reason, the fact that they apply to 99.7% of humanity, it means that they are oppressing the 0.3% of humanity for whom that is not applicable, and therefore have to be abolished entirely. Right? That's the argument.
You're gonna have to. You're gonna have a long. Yeah, you're going to have a long way to go in Spanish if you're going to be neutralizing literally every noun, because the entire language is built around gender. I'm not quite sure how you managed to fix Spanish.
Just as Latin is, it's one of the first things you learn. In fact, in English, right, you have one of the least gendered languages actually, in which we don't have the word "the" can refer to anyone. But this is not enough. That messianic fanaticism, the slightest deviation must be purged, or you are complicit in evil. That's a particular strain of Christianity. It's a particular strain of Puritanism, a particular strain of American intolerance, which is weird for a country that preaches toleration in part of its constitution and its laws. But I think it's connected, personally. I think the fact that we in America didn't have an established religion at all meant that religion was bottom up, essentially, and was competing with each other and also competing in virtue. And therefore, the most pathological attempts to create that virtue were often seen as absolutely justifiable, even if they trod over people's rights, even if they destroyed human beings, even if they were based on moral panics. I mean, from Salem through the Hollywood blacklist, through the Lavender Scare, through the childcare panic in the 1990s, if you can remember that, and now through the fact that every single thing we do is laden with white supremacy, not just racism, but white supremacy. I would call it an obvious perversion of the Christian impulse. Where is it different than Christianity?
Well, like you said, I mean, we've lost belief in God, but we still think lots of devils are still around, apparently. Yeah. And, this level of Puritanism reminds me of that line from Burroughs, nice church-going ladies with pinched, mean, bitter faces, right? It's this sort of church lady holiness that's, I think, very unique to American Protestantism. So I think it differs in a lot of things. Obviously, the notion of forgiveness, the notion, what Rod Dreher said in my interview, which is, the Christ figure is in some sense elevating the victim, but it's also an accusation. We all kind of crucified Christ, and we're all in some sense that Roman centurion, right? And that insertion of us in the sort of not starring role in the Christ narrative is something that often gets lost. One last thing I'll address, I'll back up to what I earlier said when I was making fun of Latinx or Latinx or whatever. I think certain aspects of it are going to be hard to export, but much as I'm sure you've traveled probably in Latin America or other parts of the Catholic world, Catholicism as the term implies, is universal, and it has, there's a catechism for the entire globe, but in its specific manifestations can often vary widely. If you go to the Zócalo in Mexico City, you'll see a very Latin American form of Catholicism that differs from the Vatican and certainly differs from a church in Bavaria. And so while I think, Latinx is not going to get a lot of traction, I suspect, in the wider world, I think that those same abstract patterns of thinking will be applied to whatever the sort of oppressed dialectic is in whatever country it gets exported to.